Hello and welcome to our Paper 2 group project about the Chinese Civil War. I'm Elise Tong.
I'm Ria Pai.
I'm Colin Jehlen.
And I'm Sidratul Himel.
So let's get started. All right, so the Chinese Civil War was a civil war between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, from 1927 to 1937 and from 1945 to 1949. It was as much an ideological battle as a militaristic one. It was based on a revolution, with the communists attempting to overthrow the authoritarian Nationalist Party. The Civil War had strong international support on both sides, profoundly impacting international politics for the years to come.
Now we will look at some long-term causes. One of the main long-term causes was economic inequality in Chinese society. It played a significant role in the outbreak of hostilities between the nationalists and CCP. In the period before the Chinese Civil War, 85% of China's population were peasants, and living conditions were basic, with no mechanization and methods of production. Wealthy landlords held a lot of power, and by charging very high rent, they left peasant families with very little to survive. China also had a small industrial sector, which constituted less than 10% of their GDP. The huge polarization in wealth between employers and workers left many workers living in slums and in the outskirts of cities, and it created an audience for the CCP, who advocated for a peasant revolution and social change. Also, the death of General Yuan Shikai in 1916 created a power vacuum at the center of the government, and the fragmentation of political power in China increased through the rise of regional warlords, influential landlords, and military men who used their power to establish themselves as independent dictators in their regions. Some examples of other long-term causes were the Northern Expedition, which the CCP used to spread its message to the peasantries in areas through which its army passed. The White Terror of 1927, in which the criminal organization, the Green Gang, sanctioned by the nationalist leader, launched a series of attacks on CCP headquarters and killed an estimated 400. And the Autumn Harvest Uprising, in which were CCP counterattack to the White Terror, consisting of a series of skirmishes between CCP forces, and was largely composed of peasants who operated guerrilla-style campaign in the countryside. The Nationalist Party conducted encirclement campaigns, and the first 4 of these resulted in decisive victories for the CCP, but the Nationalists did succeed in taking the Jiangxi Soviet in the 5th encirclement campaign. The Long March was when 90,000 communists encircled by the Nationalists at Jiangxi were forced to set out on a torturous retreat over 9,000 kilometers, and only 20,000 of those 90,000 survived. Another main long-term cause was Japan's occupation of Manchuria in 1931, where they established the puppet state of Manchukuo. The nationalist response to the growing Japanese threat was seen as weak because it only resulted in diplomatic sanctions being imposed against Japan. Chiang's prestige was further diminished because of his offering of concessions to the CCP, and at the same time towards Japan, and at the same time pursuing an actively aggressive policy towards the CCP. The CCP was able to survive and grow because of their establishment of a strong peasant base and an emphasis on the abolition of traditional customs. And also the CCP exploited Japan's occupation of Manchuria with a strong anti-Japanese stance and the initiation of a series of guerrilla campaigns. Although civil hostilities between the Nationalists and CCP ceased during the Second Sino-Japanese War to focus on combating the Japanese animosities, between the two broke out once again in the wake of Japanese surrender. The war gave the CCP an opportunity to enlarge its areas of control in the countryside of northern China, and the size of the CCP-controlled territory grew considerably because of the isolation of the nationalists in Chongqing. The communists were able to enact land reforms in the countryside that appealed to peasants and expanded their base areas. They also carried out the 100 Regiments campaign, where communist guerrillas destroyed railways to important coal mines in Jingshan, and communist troops continually harassed and sabotaged Japanese troops and supply lines in the countryside. Japan's surrender in the Second World War left a power vacuum, which both the nationalists and CCP raced to fill, and the war strengthened both powers in terms of military, and clashes over the territory and Japanese weaponry resumed.
All right, so here are some combatant backgrounds. So the nationalists, or Kuomintang, were first led by Song Zong-se, but then it was later led by General Jiang Gaza, who wanted to consolidate his position as the ruler of China by leading the Northern Expedition to defeat warlords and unify China. The Kuomintang wanted to create a modern, unified, and independent China through the three principles of the people. They wanted to eliminate foreign influence in China, reunify China, and ensure equality between all ethnic groups. They also wanted ordinary Chinese to participate in elections and improve public welfare by distributing some land to landless peasants, establishing rural banks, supporting the sick, old, and disabled, and nationalizing banking and railways while encouraging private business development. The communists, on the other hand, were founded by Cheng Duxiu and Li Dazhao, but Mao Zedong soon became the chairman in 1943. While the CCP also wanted to eradicate foreign powers and reunify China, their methods to do so were quite different. They wanted a profound restructuring of society according to Marxist principles. They also wanted to eliminate property ownership and bourgeoisie class privileges. The proletariat would carry out a revolution to overthrow the bourgeoisie, with the Communist Party guiding them through the revolution. Then the CCP would eventually lead themselves to absolute power and reign in dictatorship. Instead of collective leadership, there would be Mao Zedong as the single leader of China.
Now we will be looking at some practices during the war and their impact on the outcome. Firstly, the tactics employed allowed the CCP to gain decisive victory in the Chinese Civil War. The CCP focused on expanding its territory control in northern China and made significant progress in the countryside, although they were less successful in gaining control of cities initially. Their main strategy was mobile defense, which they used from the autumn of 1945, and this was a military strategy that used guerrilla tactics of sabotage and ambush to weaken the enemy by disrupting supply lines and inflicting casualties. It allowed the CCP to wear down nationalists and combat inferiority in numerical and technological advances of the nationalists. Chiang made some key mistakes that allowed the CCP to advance, although they were technically weaker. For example, he deployed an increasing number of troops to Manchuria after the CCP occupation, and this allowed them to take many key cities, but also diverted troops from northern China before the nationalists had fully secured these region, overextending its forces and making it vulnerable to communist attacks. From late 1947, the CCP strategy shifted towards large-scale assaults on urban centers once they were able to gain some strength through mobile defense. CCP assaults and sieges in the Manchuria campaign, Huaihai campaign, and the Pingjing campaign allowed them to gain control of major cities and brought them victories sooner than would have occurred if mobile defense had been continued. In addition, CCP propaganda emphasized that they were fighting a people's war, and it focused on social reform policies to gain civilian support. The CCP seized enormous provisions of food from their countryside base areas to supply their armies, which also enabled them to pursue the strategy of mobile defense.
Weapons were also a significant part of the Chinese Civil War. For example, the nationalists began by benefiting from access to U.S. armaments supplies. Although the weapons that were given by the US were important, they often arrived too late and were not used to their maximum assistance. While the CCP began to benefit from captured Japanese weaponry that were given to them by the USSR, these weapons were often not helpful because they were old in comparison to the nationalist weapons. When CCP began to capture different territories under the nationalists, the CCP used the weapons that were once used by the nationalists. Russia's assistance was also with 900 Japanese aircraft, 700 tanks, and 4,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 12,000 machine guns to the CCP.
Now, taking a look at new technology, with an increase in China's industrial sector, which heavily expanded during the 1920s to 30s, in part due to the development of new techniques in fabric, glass, and steel manufacture, economically, the only form of new technology introduced was new railway tracks being constructed in the opening of the first commercial airline in China. So for the most part, China did not innovate new technology, rather heavily relying on their allies. The nationalists benefited from the support and access of US armaments and technology bestowed to them by the US, while the CCP were benefiting from captured technology and weaponry from the Japanese, which facilitated access by the USSR. During this period, China had not pushed innovation and very few to little new technology was introduced.
During the war, nationalists were in a significant advantage of troops and economic resources. For example, in 1945, the Nationalist Army consisted of 2.7 million men, approximately 3 times the size of the Red Army. By June 1946, the proportions were similar, with the Red Army troops numbering at 1.27 million and the Nationalists at 4.3 million. CCP also had access to a militia force of around 2.2 million in August 1945, but many of these troops were untrained and ill-equipped, so they were less valuable. As the war progressed and greater numbers of territory were gained by the communists began to gain numerical superiority. The CCP, with growing numerical advantage, gave it the ability to launch 2 campaigns at the same time. Supply of weapons and food to troops was also crucial to military success. Neither side manufactured significant armaments, and so both relied on foreign supplies and captured weaponry. Despite early nationalist advantages and access to modern armaments, the CCP showed that they had more support and supplies during the war. Both armies relied on conscripts. In July 1947, Chiang issued a general mobilization bill giving the nationalists unrestricted power of conscription of China. Recruitment gangs were sent into the countryside to obtain troops, and the communists also heavily relied on conscripted peasants. Nationalist troops were far more affected by food shortages, however. Their bases in the cities made them dependent for food supplies on the railways, which were frequently cut by communist troops. CCP access to food supplies was better. They seized enormous provisions of food from their countryside base areas to supply their armies.
There was also a lot of foreign influence in the Chinese Civil War. The nationalist government was subjected to relentless aerial bombardment and found it difficult to maintain critical supplies. So the nationalists received assistance from the USA following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and its declaration of war against Japan in 1941. The US gave $2 billion in aid, including artillery, firearms, ammunition, and air power. However, the US also showed its disagreement in nationalist conduction of policies by imposing an embargo on arms sales to China between 1946 and July 1947, which actually limited the ability of the nationalists to obtain weaponry at a crucial stage in the war. The Soviets helped the CCP's occupation of Manchuria and gave CCP access to Japanese armed depot in the region, which transferred 2,000 Chinese troops of the Manchukuo regime to the CCP and prevented nationalist troops from entering some of the key cities in the region. However, Stalin instructed that Japanese communists must leave key cities in Manchuria, weakening their urban bases, and dismantled industrial machinery worth over $858 million from Manchuria for use in the USSR. One of the biggest contributions of the USA was arranging a ceasefire in Manchuria between the CCP and nationalists in 1946. It forced nationalists to halt what was a successful advance in Manchuria and gave the weaker CCP a respite to strengthen its forces and move from small guerrilla attachments to more professional, larger-scale units that could participate in conventional battle. The CCP received crucial aid from the Soviets during the ceasefire, including desperately needed heavy artillery, machine guns, and rifles.
All right, so moving to the effects of the Chinese Civil War. In terms of economic effects, even before the war, there wasn't much industrial production in China. But what industrial production that there was only weakened by the destruction of urban centers and the Soviet removal of industrial infrastructure in Manchuria. Agricultural land was annihilated by the war, and the grand majority of male peasantry were conscripted into the armies on both sides. As a result, crop yields were heavily disruptive and not much good land to work with not enough people to work on the land that was left. Furthermore, there was hyperinflation in 1949 with a thriving black market and increased crime. Because of corrupt nationalist food hoarders, reliance on large foreign loans, and the practice of printing enormous amounts of paper money, prices skyrocketed out of control. It became a lot harder to afford tiny amounts of the food that was left, so people haggled in a thriving black market. The communists tried to introduce economic reforms to save the economy, but that delayed the implementation of genuine communist principles. The CCP focused on small economic reforms to relieve the financial burdens and hardships caused by the years of warfare. With their policies, they were able to end inflation and eliminate the black market, allowing them to move forward with their communist policies.
Through the influence of the Chinese Civil War, new nations and leaderships took form. The end of the Chinese Civil War brought about political change such as the establishment of communist rule. This creation of communism helped intensify the rivalry of the Cold War. Under communist rule, the CCP held all the power. Mao Zedong became the chairman of the CCP. Military campaigns begun by Mao Zedong to achieve reunification of China and assimilation of Tibet. The nationalists who became located in Taiwan continued to maintain the belief that they were the legitimate government of China, which led to military clashes in the Taiwanese Straits in the 1950s. Because of the Chinese Civil War, USA became determined to act to resist its spread. It was a common perception in the US that they did not do enough to help the nationalists. This was shown in the example of the Korean War, and the US took aggressive acts towards the war and gave a lot of troops and equipment.
Now, the social effects of the Chinese Civil War led to a handful of changes, including those on women, particularly the minority group, and the social structure. So, although the Chinese Civil War looked to bring upon improvement, it claims that most of women's lives had not changed much, or if anything, became harder, but it did have many positive impacts. It notably affected the minority group of women. Rights in the legal, educational, and political status and/or opportunities improved. But that's not saying rights for all women had not improved. For example, arranged marriage was a common practice in early China, but in 1930, due to the civil code, women in nationalist zones were allowed to deny arranged marriages if they do not consent to the marriage. It is deemed prohibited, as well as divorce not becoming a right for women to initiate. This led to an expansion in legal rights and opportunities for women, as they had a say in marriage, which was not offered before the war. And just not to mention, daughters were now given equal rights to inheritance like that of sons. Additionally, an improvement in labor laws allowed women to reap benefits in the workforce. In 1931, a labor law was demanded which sought to give women the same rate of pay as men for the same work. Although it brought really no real change, particularly for the women in the remote rural communities, it was a step towards improving labor laws, which was geared towards women. Although seeming contradictory, women in the communist zones, specifically the CCP-controlled zones, women were encouraged to participate in CCP committees in which many women served as officials. During this period, women gained a major amount of respect and rights, so much so that women were even regarded as being a legitimate source of manual labor as men. Women were heavily involved in manual work in the fields, more so than before, and many of them served in the Red Army and communist militias. The war, although seemingly improved little aspects for women to make life easier, it still served as a stepping stool for improvements later, with many new laws, rules, and work opportunities favoring women. The war had an impact on the social aspect one way or the other. But besides an improvement in women's living conditions, overall it had a positive impact on all the citizens. The social structure progressively increased with the removal of landlords. Peasants were allotted land due to communist land reforms. Those same landlords were also persecuted by local peasantry.
In terms of territorial changes, there was not a lot of ways in which the map changed. However, through the reunification campaigns, which were China's military campaigns to annex Tibet and Jiangxing to China, Tibet was renamed Jiangxing and was forcibly incorporated into China. There was also periodic military clashes between the PRC and ROC over the Taiwanese Strait, which arose in the 1950s. American forces were authorized by Congress to defend Taiwan and prevent it from becoming communist. In addition, Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, and within days, the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc recognized it as the legitimate government of China. In 1949, the nationalist government also officially informed foreign diplomats that it was relocating its capital to Chongqing.
All right, so as discussed in the political effects of the Chinese Civil War, China evolved from a relatively democratic and capitalist nationalist government to a communist dictatorship. Under communist rule, China underwent vast ideological changes, becoming a Marxist-Leninist Maoist state, persecuting political opponents, revering the single head of the party, and using terror and coercion to control people under their power. While nationalism intended to ensure equality between all ethnic groups and popular sovereignty with the participation of ordinary Chinese in elections, the reigning communists focused on the adulation of Mao as the leader of China, with centralized government controlling as many aspects of society as possible.
Now, the historiography. Now, it it had very limited historian perspectives, but taking a look at revisionist historians, Zheng Cheng and John Halliday, they have also been critical of the Chinese Civil War, arguing that Mao's egotism and vanity resulted in a great deal of domestic violence and suffering. Both authors represent Mao as a power-hungry, egomaniac opportunist who accidentally became a revolutionary leader of a war. Now, thank you guys for sitting through this presentation. We hope that you guys enjoyed it and learned a little something. So thank you very much.